Alright, and welcome back to yet another intermediate level Illustrator tutorial. This is the last one before we get to advanced, so I gotta say, I'm impressed that you've made it this far and you've been doing awesome. So let's get into it. We're doing the blend tool today. We will go ahead and start with it by saying that it is accessed by the W key and is located here on the toolbar. The blend tool has a bunch of different ways that it can be interacted with that we'll get into, but the most basic way is to just take two shapes of either the same or varying colors and blend them into one another, like so. So we select each of these and it makes a smooth transitioning shape from one to the next. Now we can keep this chain going for as long as we want with varying success because it is and it is not the most user-friendly thing in the world. However, there's a lot of fun that you can have with it, just messing around with it. So let's go ahead and try this one more time. That was poor planning on my part. There we go. That's how I wanted it. I had my shapes out of line. But you can keep this going as much as you want. There's a couple finer details that we'll get into that'll explain a few of the hiccups that I just had. But first, you can take this. It's treated as a whole path now, but if you so desired it, you could select an individual shape from it with your direct select tool and then go to either transform or just your regular selection tool and rotate the shape to your liking. And just as a side note, isn't that a very pretty, almost 3D visual? Entirely 2D, but it creates the illusion of 3 dimensions because of the motion. It's very calming to look at. Now, another use that we have for this can be accessed by clicking twice on the tool itself on the toolbar. We're going to be going to specified steps, and we're going to set this to 10. And we're going to leave the orientation at align to page. One moment. Apologies. And what we will do is we're going to select one of these squares and then select another. And what that did is that created, like we said before, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 new squares between the two that are equidistant from one square to the next between these two squares, which will give us a total of 12. And these are treated as a path. So let's take our Shift C anchor point tool and move this path. Has a bit of a weird visual to it because it's loading a lot at once, but after we release our click, you'll see that these follow the path pretty adamantly. We will go ahead and leave this like so, and then move on to the next one, which, one moment, deselect that, double click, and we will do the same thing, set this to, let's call it 8, and then change our orientation. And just for the fun of it, we'll also go ahead and select this and change the color to a nice muted green, kind of a jungly muted green. And we will take our blend tool and go from one to the other, and you'll see that it does in specified steps goes from one color to the other, similar to how the gradient tool works. And when we go this way, you'll see instead of going flat topped, this contours the squares in such a way, rotating them to follow the path. Now this has a lot of uses to it that you could do, creating a keystone effect, maybe making an arch over a design using circles or squares or really whatever shape you want. I'd be partial to seeing upside down equilateral triangles over something. Just had that off the dome right now, but that's a thought for later perhaps. Lastly, we have, one moment, specified distance, which we will set to, let's say 1.2 inches, and we'll set that back to regular. And we will go from one to the next. And as opposed to having a set number of squares between the two squares that we picked, it puts squares every set distance that we place. So we said 1.2 inches, so every 1.2 inches there is a new square. And again, just like before, it adheres the same way. Now let's clear this up a little bit because there's something a little more interesting that I want to show you all. Which is how to make this work with text. Now, right quick, we're going to make all of those into outlines, and we're going to go to smooth color, and we're just going to select from one to the other. Now, that did not do what we saw with the shapes, right? So what do we do in the face of that? Well, we would go to our specified steps. We would set the number to something very high, like let's say 200. And then we would go from one to the other. And suddenly we have this very interesting 3D effect going along a path that we can then move to our liking as needed. Now, I am not one to use this very often because 3D text effects they have their place, and when they don't have their place, they very clearly do not have their place. However, going back to what I said in a previous tutorial about liking the 90s aesthetic, this fits the 90s aesthetic to a T. Putting a three-dimensional text on a skew like this with a gradient going front to back, that bleeds 90s energy. And I will say I do have a soft spot for it in that regard, and because of that, I fully endorse using it where it's appropriate. The sky's the limit with this tool. Ooh. Terribly sorry, dropped my water. Your creativity is the only boundary that you have on what you can do with it. Feel free to experiment with it and go forth and make something great. We will be starting our advanced tutorials right after this. Until then.